All right, great. Welcome everyone to our webinar on navigating the regulatory requirements of wireless power transfer with Element. My name is Allison Moody. I'll be facilitating today's webinar. It's my pleasure to introduce you to our expert, Steve Hayes. Steve is a chartered electrical engineer and technical director of the Connected Technologies business unit of Element. He's just celebrated his 30 years with Element and thinks he's just getting to grips with product approvals and regulations. Complicated topic. As well as providing overall technical leadership within Element, Steve sits on a number of industry groups and forums, including being the author of a number of guidance notes for the European Radio and EMC notified body groups. Steve is also the convener of CISPR-B Working Group 1, which is responsible for the publication of CISPR 11, which covers products such as WPT, which we'll be covering today. Before I hand over to Steve, I wanted to encourage everyone to submit any questions you have on the GoToWebinar panel on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you do lose connection or audio for any reason, please refresh your browser or re-enter the GoToWebinar platform. We also greatly appreciate any feedback you have for us in the post-event survey you'll see pop up on your screen. Thank you, everyone. And with that, I'll turn it over to Steve.
Great, thank you, Alison, and hello and welcome to this webinar as Alison's introduced. I'll start off and just go through the agenda of what I hope to talk to you about today. So really starting off and having a look at what wireless power transfer and WPT actually is, together with the different types of WPT that exist. Before we then go on and have a look at the different regulatory frameworks around the globe. I'm probably going to focus, not probably, I am definitely going to really focus on the North American and European regulatory requirements, and I'll explain that as we get into it. And then that will naturally lead into aspects related to standardization. Have a look into the future in terms of what's coming up before we finish with some conclusions, and then go into that Q&A session that Alison introduced earlier on. So hopefully that'll take us, I don't know, somewhere between 30-40 minutes, and then that will give us good time to answer any questions that you might have. So as Alison said, feel free to drop your comments into the dialog box there, and hopefully we can resolve them at the end. Okay, so let's make a start then, and what better place to start than actually trying to define what wireless power transfer actually is. So I've taken this definition. The trouble is with wireless power transfer isn't really a new technology, but it's seeing lots of new use cases, which is accelerating its adoption and relevance in a global market. So I've taken this as a pretty standard definition of what WPT is. So transfer of electrical energy from a power source to an electrical load via electric and/or magnetic fields or electromagnetic waves. There's a note on there about sometimes we replace transfer with transmission, but essentially the definition is pretty well defined. So just looking at that definition for a moment, there are two things here. First of all, we have a power source, and then we're talking about the transfer of that energy from the source to a load. Now, historically, we might think about it used for charging things up. So electric toothbrush, a vehicle or something like that. But of course, if we have got a guarantee of the transfer of that electrical energy, then it may be that we can reduce the size of batteries in the load itself, and even replace batteries completely with just a pure wireless transfer system that negates the need for batteries itself, reduces the weight or the size of that load, and therefore help with the untethering and increasing the mobility of it altogether. So then the next part of that, we're looking at electric and/or magnetic fields. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail, but really what we're talking about here is the coupling of electromagnetic fields and through electromagnetic waves, where we're really talking about radiation, whether that be magnetic radiation or electric radiation. So two distinct types of WPT. And again, we'll get into some of the more detailed terms as we start to work through the presentation itself. Okay, so let's have a look at the different types of WPT. So at the high level, fundamentally, we've got electromagnetic induction and electromagnetic radiation. So on the left leg of that decision tree or hierarchy diagram, we then go into inductive coupling. And when we talk about inductive coupling, we're really talking about the transfer of that energy at the power frequency itself, typically 50 or 60 hertz, depending upon what region in the world you're in. And that coupling typically we see in perhaps legacy technologies such as induction cooking plates or inductively coupled and charged toothbrushes, those sorts of things, where the technology is really relatively simple, and effectively we're using it like a transformer, where the primary coil is embedded into one half and the load effectively is the secondary coil. So typically a ferrous metal providing the secondary of a transformer and providing coupling through that type of mechanism. The other side, and where we've seen many more use cases in recent years, is with regard to magnetic resonant induction. And this is where we basically resonate a coil, maybe offset the coil frequency slightly, but essentially we're at some higher frequency to get improved efficiency, and also resonating the coil to get maximum power transfer between the source and the load device. When we think about resonant type technology, we're thinking about high power applications such as electric vehicle charging. We're also looking at other technologies that you see in many consumer goods these days. So whether that be cell phones, robotic devices being used to charge various different types of battery powered product, wearable technologies, many use cases, probably represents the majority of the use cases that we have on the market today are covered by magnetic resonant induction. The frequency range on which they operate is typically below 30 megahertz, and very often the higher the power application, typically the lower the frequency are these devices. So from a few tens, hundreds of kilohertz, right the way through to a few megahertz. But all of this type of technology is all sub 30 megahertz. We generically call all of these types of WPT as non-beam. That's not to say that they are not directional, but because they are all relatively low frequency, antennas typically tend to be more omnidirectional at below 30 megahertz. And therefore, the term non-beam really originates with the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, and although they're using the term non-beam, really what we want to say is magnetic, predominantly magnetic-based phenomena. We contrast that to the other side, where we're actually using the electromagnetic wave to provide some form of radiation. And actually, one of the exciting and new areas of this type of WPT is in more the UHF or even microwave frequencies. Clearly, there have been some use cases that have been around for many years. So you could argue that a microwave oven is a type of wireless power transfer, not really transferring power itself, but certainly transferring of that energy to a load, albeit in the case of food. But in terms of these other new use cases, certainly many types of wearable technology, web or internet-based sensor networks, many are medical applications where you might have implantable devices, where it's very expensive and potentially more high risk when you've got to open up a patient to replace the batteries before reinserting the active device in the patient and sewing that back up, and all the complications that you can imagine that go with that. So some of these new exciting use cases relate to what we call at a distance charging that enable you to have a primary device on the outside and the load inside the patient itself. And we've got many other new types of use cases: electronic shelf labels, assisted listening devices such as hearing aids, where perhaps there's some distinct advantages if you can charge these devices without having to plug in wires. Because the demographic of the population that's using it, you can imagine somebody that is wearing assisted listening device like a hearing aid, for example, where there are very small button type batteries that need to be swapped out at the moment, or very small cable sockets that need to be connected up. The demographic is such that they don't necessarily have the best dexterity, and therefore replacing all of that with a wireless charging technology is seen as a real benefit to society itself. And then the last category is laser or light power. I'm not really going to go into detail about that in this presentation today. That typically is more high power, so things like laser cutting, laser etching, laser powering to replace batteries that rely still on wires, and so that is another type of electromagnetic radiation, WPT, but a little bit more niche or niche, and therefore outside the scope of what we'll be covering today. But all of those devices on the right side, again, we group together and we call beam WPT. Now, when we say beam, we don't mean beam forming. That may be something that people work on in the years ahead, but what we really mean is directivity. So as we go higher in frequency, electric waves become more directional, and so therefore the ITU just generically refers to these as beam WPT, where the antenna has some directivity to it. It's not beam forming per se. So the fundamental thing that people need to ask and answer in terms of looking at WPT is, certainly from a regulatory point of view, is whether there is intelligence in the frequency where the energy is transferred. So in the example that I've got on the screen here, the carrier frequency has got a form of modulation. So there is just one carrier that is brought up, and within that carrier that is modulated, and the reason for modulating that is to provide a communication link with the load itself to get feedback information like what is the battery status, maybe some health and usage information about the load as well. But fundamentally, there is some intelligence in that signal. There only needs to be one bit of data, but if there is one bit of data, then it is categorized as a type of WPT, as opposed to the other type where the frequency used for the transfer of the energy itself is just a CW signal, it's just a carrier wave. The information about what the load is doing, what its status in terms of battery level and this other information is typically provided through other types of communication. The example I've got on the screen here is Bluetooth at 2.4 gig. It could be any other proprietary type of communication mechanism, but I really wanted to identify and get in your mind the two different types of WPT. One where the frequency has no intelligence, it's just a pure CW signal, and the other where it's got some form of modulation, which is, if you like, an intelligent signal. The reason why that is really important is because around the world we have different regulations that apply depending upon which of those two categories it falls into. This is probably a good time to introduce the concept and actually define what ISM is, because that CW signal that I was referring to in the previous slide is considered to be a type of ISM. So if we look at the definition of ISM, first of all, where is that defined? And the answer is in the ITU radio regulations. The ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, define all matters relating to the radio spectrum itself in terms of what you can't do, how the spectrum is divided up, agreements that are in place around the world. In the case of ISM, I'll get more into the detail of this a little bit later on, but in the case of ISM, there is an international standard called CISPA 11. So first of all, CISPA is a special committee within the IEC that deals with and provides test methods and limits to protect radio services relating to ISM equipment. So inside that standard, we have that definition that you see on the top right of the screen. So industrial, scientific and medical applications and ISM applications of radio frequency energy, this is. And it defines it as operation of equipment or appliances to generate and use locally radio frequency energy for industrial, scientific, medical, domestic or similar purposes, excluding applications in the field of telecommunications. When we get inside the standard itself, then it defines the types of products into two groups. Group 1 is everything that isn't a group 2. So what's in group 2? Group 2 contains all ISM RF equipment in which radio frequency energy in the frequency unit range 9 kHz to 400 GHz is intentionally generated and used or only used locally in the form of electromagnetic radiation, inductive and or capacitive coupling for the treatment of material, for inspection and analysis purposes, or for the transfer of electromagnetic energy. So clearly, ISM is a type of Group 2 ISM equipment, or WPT, I should say, is a type of Group 2 ISM equipment as defined in the international standard CISPA 11. Why is CISPA 11 important? The answer is because many of the different radio, or I beg your pardon, many of the different EMC requirements around the world get their requirements and base those requirements on CISPA 11 itself. So for example, in the US, Part 18 of the FCC rules is written in a very similar way to CISPA 11. In Europe, EN 55011 is the European equivalent of CISPA 11. In Korea, KN 11 is the Korean equivalent of CISPA 11. So all standards that relate to ISM typically point back to the CISPA standards and specifically to CISPA 11. If we get into the detail of CISPA 11 itself, they define ISM frequencies. So what are ISM frequencies? Well, they're frequencies that can be used and that have been agreed right around the world for ISM applications. So if we look at the table that's on the screen now, we can see the first column that defines the center frequency of the ISM band. The ISM band or frequency range is defined in the next column. And the third column, titled maximum radiation limit, gives a hint as to what the power or restrictions are for each one of those frequency ranges. It then references back to the ITU radio regulations as to what controls or defines those parameters. So on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see section 5.150 relates to the last column of the table, where it defines those frequency ranges. Now, what a lot of radio communication manufacturers tend to do is use ISM frequencies. I'm sure those designers that are on the call here today won't have escaped the notice that many of those frequencies we see being used by radio communication services. I'll come on to why many radio communication services use ISM bands in just a few moments, but the text that I've highlighted in yellow gives a hint to what's coming up next. And the hint is, and the statement that says, radio communication services operating within these bands must accept harmful interference which may be caused by these applications. So what it's saying is, from an international perspective, is if you are a manufacturer of ISM equipment, your product is the primary user of that band. And if there are communication services that also operate in that band, then they are a secondary user to ISM, which is why their product must accept harmful interference. So if that's the case, why do we have so many radio communication products using ISM bands? Well, here's an example or a list of the different ISM frequencies and what radio communication services use those bands for. So 13.56 megahertz, for example, is used by electronic article surveillance. So these are typically the large loops that you see in shops and garages and those sorts of things. If you were to walk out with something that hadn't been paid for or whatever. So they're used as a security type device. We also have inductive loop systems, whether it be for generic use or low frequency, relatively low frequency communication type techniques as well. So those are a couple of examples that use the 13.56 ISM band. 433 megahertz is perhaps a little bit less so now, but historically, just a generic frequency band which is used by many different types of general purpose short range devices, SRDs. They include things like car alarms, garage door openers, maybe some radio controlled toys. There's really many use cases and applications for 433 meg band. We've then got 915 megahertz, which is used for RFID, where actually it's a high power frequency application typically, where we're using an interrogator, or a high power transmitter, to transfer energy to a passive tag, typically a capacitor, which would then get charged up to act as the battery source for this passive tag, which will then provide some backscatter communications to identify the unique tag itself to either allow you access into a building or other type of identification type applications. We then have the 2.4 gig band, which is probably one of the most densely populated and most high profile communication bands used by Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, Zigbee. We also use that band for certain medical implants as well. A very popular band, and I didn't put on there, but I indicated it right at the beginning, but is also used for microwave ovens and the like as well. Then we have the 5.8 gigahertz band, which is used by, again, generic short-range devices. So why do wireless communication devices use ISM bands? Well, the short answer is that ISM bands are truly harmonized throughout the world. Because they're defined in the ITU radio regulations, they are typically the same frequency bands throughout the world. And therefore, if you're designing a radio product, if you can design a single frequency variant, then the number of SKUs that you've got or variant products is reduced to one, and therefore it just makes your life that much more simple. Historically, it should also be noted that there are very few ISM applications which existed. So although many manufacturers, communication manufacturers, may have realized it's an ISM band and there is, on the whole, an unrestricted power level that can be used in that band, you might think the probability of interference is very high. But if there are very few actual ISM applications, and those are maybe in industrial type scenarios, then the probability of interference for communications is very low. And that, combined with standardizing and having just one SKU for a worldwide market, makes it particularly attractive. Another reason why many radio designers use ISM bands is because they're unaware of what ISM bands actually are. I can imagine that if you go to your typical vendor for sourcing components and modules, and it says there is a very low cost 433 megahertz transmitter here, or a 2.4 gigahertz transmitter, because they're manufactured in such vast quantities, you might think, well, I'm only communicating over a short distance, the unit cost is very low, and therefore I'll just simply use that module and integrate it into my host for my particular use case, and everything is good in the world, without realizing what ISM bands actually are and what the probability of interference might be. So I can imagine that if you were a designer, in your head, there would be certain thought processes that you'd be going through. And to me, when I was thinking about this, I could imagine that I would go, well, what frequencies get me into the most number of countries? What frequency band product will get me into the most number of countries? Is there a good source of chipsets or modules? And what's the unit cost like of that? And if I can answer all three of those positively, I would probably end up designing my device around those sorts of chipsets or modules that I could buy in and use within my device itself. I'm really, the message that I want to come on to is, manufacturers of communication products that use these ISM bands do so, but at the detriment of a higher probability of interference. So fundamentally, we've got two different types of intentional radiator around the world. We've got ISM devices, which are allowed to intentionally transmit RF energy, but not for communications. And then we have radio or wireless products, which are also a type of intentional radiator, but for communication purposes. So I highlighted earlier on that I really would be focusing on two regions of the world, and those predominantly here are USA and Europe. I'm going to contradict myself a little bit on the next slide when I introduce Canada as well. But for the time being, Part 18 of the FCC rules is dedicated to ISM type applications. We also then have Part 15 of the FCC rules, which then subdivide into unintentional radiators, typical IT type products, digital devices, and then Part 15C, which is reserved for intentional radiators. So it is slightly dependent on the product itself and how it works as to which of those parts the WPT device falls under the scope of for regulatory approval in the US itself. And I'll get onto the detail of that in the next slide. One thing I did want to highlight is a KDB which specifically addresses WPT. The reason why there is a KDB, or a knowledge database, KDB's acronym, is because of the number of use cases which are now being rolled out for WPT itself. And in fact, this KDB is right in the process of being updated, if it hasn't done or been already, that allows for new types of use cases and new theories of operation of WPT, which allows for at a distance charging rather than close coupling between the source and the load of the WPT system itself. I contrast that with the European situation. When I say European, I'm talking about a mixture of CE marking for the EU and UKCA marking in the case of the UK. Both of those regulatory requirements are the same, but slightly different regulatory requirements since the UK left the EU. And typically, ISM devices are covered under the EMC directive, and wireless devices are covered under the Radio Equipment Directive. Now, the Radio Equipment Directive in Europe defines radio equipment both for communication and radio determination. And it doesn't matter whether it's a transmitter or a receiver or a combination of both of those. All of those types of products are covered under the Radio Equipment Directive. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back to our original, or one of our original slides, where we were defining what type of WPT system it is that you would be thinking about. So here is scenario one. Scenario one is where a WPT device is a type of radio equipment itself. So this is where there is intelligence in the signal. The signal, the carrier frequency, has some form of modulation to get the feedback on what is happening with the load. In this particular example, typically the communication part of it will be covered by part 15C, so the intentional radiator, and then the WPT device has lots of other digital electronics around it as well, and that bit of it would be covered under part 15B. But fundamentally, where it's this intelligent type of charger, typically that's approved under part 15C. It may be that part 18 would also apply, but in this particular case, because the carrier is being modulated, it would typically be approved under part 15C. And I refer you back to that KDB, because the KDB provides some more granular details as to whether part 15 is also applicable, or in lieu of that with just part 15 only. I mentioned that I would introduce Canada here. So the Canadians with ISED, or Industry Canada, actually have brought the two worlds together, the ISM and the radio or wireless device regulations. And so they have a standard called RSS 216, and that just covers WPT. The detail of whether it's communication or just an ISM device is in the RSS 216 standard itself. And therefore, if you're designing a product for the Canadian market, that is the standard that would apply for all types of WPT, irrespective of the theory of operation. In the UK, typically at the moment, most of the WPT radio devices are typically below 30 megahertz, and we have two standards that could be applied. 300/330, which is a generic inductive coupling short-range device standard, and another standard 303.417, which is specifically to address WPT. The reason I've put two standards on the screen there is 300.330 is what's called a harmonized standard, and 417 is a non-harmonized standard. So if a manufacturer is thinking of getting a below 30 megahertz product onto the European market, then the test requirements are pretty much the same in both of those, but it depends on the theory of operation and what frequency band they're operating on as to whether one would be acceptable or not. 417, because it's not a harmonized standard, would require the use of what's called a notified body for Europe. One thing I really wanted to highlight here is I kept on talking about ISM without any restriction on the fundamental frequency. So theoretically, you know, it could be megawatts of power that is transferred. But the reality is that all of these devices will also have to undergo an RF exposure assessment, which is a type of safety test, if you like, to make sure that we as individuals and domestic animals are not exposed to RF levels and fields which would give us health, a degradation in health. And so whilst in theory there could be infinite power transmitted, it's the RF exposure requirements that will really define what powers can be used in WPT applications. And that's true in the US, North America, as much as it is in Europe or any other region around the world. It's no good coming up with a device that can transmit megawatts if you know it's immediately going to give you health effects or even long-term health effects. These devices still need to comply with the international regulations, the International Radiological Protection Board (ICNIRP) requirements, which we see manifested in FCC rules and under the Radio Equipment Directive as well, in terms of the health and safety requirements of the Radio Equipment Directive. If we then think about WPT as an ISM device, so this is now where the carrier frequency has got no modulation and the communication is done by other types of communication technique. So in the US, that the ISM bit of it could be assessed under Part 15B as an unintentional radiator or Part 15A. And again, I'll refer you back to that KDB. Here, we've also got, if you like, a Bluetooth module that would be integrated into the final equipment, and therefore the Bluetooth device is an intentional radiator and therefore would be assessed under Part 15C. In Canada, I said there's no difference between ISM and wireless. You've got RSS 216, so that's still the same standard that would be applied. In Europe, the ISM frequency, so the power frequency, if you like, would be assessed under the EMC regulations because there's no intelligence under in the signal. So there's the European equivalent of CISPR 11, EN 55011. But again, in this case, the Bluetooth that's integrated into that final equipment, that would be assessed under the appropriate standard for that type of technology. So in the case of Bluetooth, it would be 300.328, for example. So when we're thinking about WPT as an ISM device, the way that the European regulations are written is that you only have a product that is placed on the market. So here, in the example that we've got here, a WPT that has got, if you like, just a CW carrier frequency and a different frequency or technology used for the communication. The power frequency would be assessed under the EMC regulations, and the communication part would be assessed under Article 3.2 to make sure that the communications function is operating on the right frequency, got all the right channel access mechanisms implemented for that particular type of technology itself. So why do we need to think about all of these aspects then? Well, the answer is that we do have a finite amount of frequency spectrum. So we all need to play nicely together, if I can put it like that. And therefore, co-location or having close neighbours is something that we need to deal with. And in order to resolve that dealing with and playing nicely together, the way that we reduce the probability of interference is, first of all, making sure that we have different frequencies for different applications. So fundamentally, you know, it's not ideal to have ISM and communication on the same frequency. We don't have the separation at that point. We could physically separate things so they have greater distance between them. And we certainly see that in many of the like Wi-Fi type technologies where, for example, an access point, it might say only to be used in an indoor environment. We assume that there's some attenuation with the building it's located in, which will allow us to use that same frequency range outside for different types of applications. So just physically separating the source from the victim will improve the probability of interference, or I should say, improve the possibility of interference occurring. Clearly, the lower the power level, the more deployed devices that we can have, because it's unlikely that the carrier frequency, the peak level, will travel as far, and therefore lower power means higher density of products. And then we have mitigation techniques such as frequency hopping. So if interference occurs, it's only going to be for a moment in time before it's hopped onto the next frequency. We can also reduce the duty cycle, so the on to off period, that will improve the probability of interference. And then we have more advanced techniques like detect and avoid, where you listen to what's in the frequency band first. If there's another neighbor already there on the frequency that you want to use, then you'll go into an alternate channel and use that to avoid any interference. So there's a number of different techniques and measures that we can deploy to make sure that WPT doesn't interfere with communication technologies, or vice versa, communication doesn't interfere with WPT if it's using an ISM band. So in terms of what's going on in the world, in terms of WPT, the answer is an awful lot. In terms of the different wireless technologies and use cases, I think it would be fair to say that WPT is debated almost as much as all of the others put together. It is a really hot potato, if I can use that expression. In terms of what's happening at the moment, I mentioned before about the FCC KDB on wireless power transfer, which tells manufacturers what they need to do and how to categorize their product. It also talks about novel techniques and applications which may require PAG, pre-approval guidance, that an organization such as Element can get involved and discuss directly with the FCC. We've got the publication of RSS 216, I mentioned for Canada. And then we've got other countries like Japan, which are starting to recognize WPT as a radio station that allows certain types of WPT to be rolled out in Japan alongside other radio devices by defining it as a radio station. CISPA 11, which I was referring to earlier on, has got a number of updates in progress. Essentially, they fall into two categories. There is a project that is looking at the low frequency side, specifically on electric vehicle charging. And there's another project, which is, if you like, the UHF side of things, where they're looking at beam type WPT, where you can use it at a distance. And that standard will hopefully be updated towards the end of this year or during the course of next year. In Europe, we have the CPT. So CPT is the Centralized Post and Telecommunications Office that coordinates spectrum planning, if you like, across Europe. They have a document called Recommendation 7003. 7003 is, as it suggests, a recommendation, but it is a very useful document if you were thinking about deploying a WPT type system, what frequencies would be available to be used. Historically, it's been used for radio communication technologies, but within CPT, there's a discussion at the moment, and they're trying to decide whether they have a dedicated annex in that document for WPT. So all of the WPT's technologies can be easily looked up in one simple annex. And then internationally, we have the ITU, Study Group 1A, which is in the process of recognizing certain new frequencies as ISM frequencies or used by ISM type applications. And what I mean by that specifically is in the case of things like electric vehicle charging and some of these other techniques below 30 megahertz. There's also work going on for the UHF-based ones at things like 915, 2.4, 5.8 gigahertz, etc., as well as these new use cases are defined. So, in terms of wrapping up, to allow us a couple of minutes for questions, I just wanted to leave you with really three conclusions. The first one, fundamentally, is you've got to decide whether this WPT device that you're thinking about is ISM or it's a radio device. Is there intelligence in the signal or not? The regulatory requirements internationally at the moment are very complex and fast changing, which then leads me on to the last point, which is you really need to be working closely with an expert to make sure that if you're designing a product, you're going to design it in a way that gives you the maximum probability or chance of actually getting it allowed to be used in the country or region in which you anticipate its use. Okay, I'm just going to hand you over to Alison, who will do a little bit of wrapping up on who Element is before we get into the Q&A. So, Alison, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Steve, for such an informative presentation. I hope everyone enjoyed that deep dive into the world of WPT, and we're looking forward to answering your questions next. But first off, just to give you a little bit more information about Element, we're one of the largest independent providers of material and product testing and certification services in the world, operating across connected technologies, life sciences, transportation, aerospace, and many other sectors where failure in service is not an option. We're experts in connectivity and interoperability with the global reach and capacity to enable global market access for innovators around the world, bringing your products from R&D to reality. Our purpose as an organization is to make tomorrow safer than today, and you saw that today in us helping you make sure that your products that you're bringing to market are compliant with regulatory requirements around the world for WPT. Our main values are integrity, care, and progress. So these inform everything that we do and the partnerships that we form with customers. So thank you very much for your time and attention. And now we'll dive into Q&A. Before we get started though, just wanted to remind you that if you want to call us, email us, or reach out to us at element.com/contact us anytime you have a question or a testing need. You can also reach out and follow us on LinkedIn and subscribe on our website to get emails a couple times a quarter with webinars, white papers, and more great technical content from our experts like Steve direct to your inbox. So now let's open it up for Q&A. And just a reminder, if we aren't able to answer your question today, I saw quite a few coming in, we'll follow up with you via email, and we'll also send those answers and the recording of this presentation to everybody after the presentation concludes. So ask away in the chat function, and we'll get started with a few of the questions that came in initially. So Steve, can you talk us through What are the limitations in the commercial application of WPT in the short, medium, and long term?
Wow, that's a big question to start with. I think, I mean, first of all, great question. I think some of this will maybe how to answer this. Short term, categorizing products with low power and using ISM frequencies or already established frequencies is going to be the way of getting a product on the market in a short period of time. As the power goes up and the new type of use cases come online, some of those things are still being discussed in regulatory circles, and therefore becomes more complicated. I think it's fair to say, though, there is a direction of travel that sees so many use cases for WPT. And you know, as a society, we've got rid of cables for communications already, and therefore the only thing that's really tethering product to a stationary location are the power side. So if we can get rid of the AC cord, then it opens up so many new possibilities. And really a lot of the work that's being done internationally at the moment is to help evolve the whole community, new frequencies, higher power applications, which in itself will then drive new use cases. So I think at the moment, it is relatively restricted, but as these different regulators around the world get to grips and understand more about these things, we'll find that more opens up over the next few years. So again, watch this space, I guess. Yeah.
Great. For those bands in CISPR 11 that are marked unrestricted, does that mean that it has to meet SAR safety limits and that's it? And then what are the limits?
Okay, so the limits that we see in CISPR 11 are all to do with it being categorized as an ISM band. There is no connection between CISPR 11 and health and safety legislation around the world. That's where the FCC KDB that I was referencing before for the North American market, and then Article 3.1a, which is the safety requirements for the European market, come in. And we have harmonized standards in Europe that define the limits for that, and then we have the FCC rules that define the SAR requirements as well. So that was my point about it might say unrestricted power, but actually very often is the SAR requirements that actually will limit the power that ultimately can be transmitted.
Great, thanks, Steve. Next, this is a two-part question. Isn't there a third type of WPT where it's a CW frequency for charging and there's no communication at all? For example, a low-power toothbrush charger where the device does not provide any feedback to the charger and the charger is not looking for any feedback. It should be type number 2 in the slide without Bluetooth. And then the follow-up is, if this type of WPT device is a dumb inductive carrier only with no communication part, is it only FCC Part 18 device and only EMCD LVD, not red?
Yes, that is correct. So I identified it, it's absolutely right. I identified inductive toothbrushes and induction cooking hobs in one of those earlier slides. I didn't go down to talk about the detail, only because it's an established technology. It's been around for many, many years. But it's absolutely right that it falls under Part 18 of the FCC rules and is covered under the EMC and the Low Voltage Directive for Europe. So that is correct, yeah.
Okay, great. What is the difference between WPT and IPT, which is inductive power transfer?
So I think you could, again, from a hierarchical sense, you could think WPT is the overarching title, and inductive or IPT is a subset of WPT. In essence, IPT is a type of WPT. It inductively couples the energy. The only reason why in some standards we call it IPT is because of historic reasons, and they didn't want to get lumbered with the WPT title, but it is a type of WPT.
What's the best approach for compliance to FCC RF exposure rules for a portable medical WPT device?
Okay, so when we start thinking about medical devices, we've got two different sets of regulations now. We've got FCC who regulate the airwaves, and then we've got the FDA which regulate the medical side of things. So the FCC, irrespective of what your device is, if it is a medical application, then you still have to do FCC approval, but additionally you will have to do FDA approval as well. And when you start putting these devices inside people, that's really going to complicate the RF exposure side quite dramatically. And therefore, early engagement with regulatory affairs professionals such as ourselves, in conjunction with the FDA, to work through what those SAR requirements, RF exposure requirements are going to be, is going to be critically important. But you've got FCC regulating SAR on one side, but it won't take into account use cases where that device is implanted within a person that's regulated under FDA. So effectively, it's like bringing those two worlds together. So there's almost two separate conversations that have to be had.
Okay, great. And then I think we've got time for one more question. So for everybody, if we weren't able to address your question during the webinar, we will definitely follow up with you by email. And you can also get in touch with us if you have any follow-up questions or would like to schedule a meeting with one of our experts. So our last question here, in FCC KDB 680106, if a WPT device works at ISM band and only transmits load modulation for power management and control, there is no other communication about other information, is it okay to use part 18? It seems such device belongs to type 1 WPT, which you said should use part 15C.
Yeah, I understand the question. I think what I'd like to do is perhaps take that one offline, because it's quite a wordy question, and I wouldn't want to give the wrong advice there. Needless to say that the KDB that's just been updated is very comprehensive. There is a danger when things are so comprehensive, they also make it complicated at the same time. So let me take that one offline. We love the question, and I'll come back and answer that directly if that's okay.
Great. Okay, well, I think that wraps it up for today then. Thank you everyone for your attention and for all your detailed questions. We'll send out the recording and the question answers after this presentation concludes. And feel free to get in touch with us if we can help with any additional questions you have or any testing and certification needs. Thank you very much, everyone.